Bamboo courtyard. The executioner tightened the rope until the confined peasant's fingers whitened against the wood. Betrayal hung in the courtyard air. The magistrate had already signed the lists that sent men here. The crowd shifted. A guard barked an order and 3 men pushed the bamboo contraption into place. The narrator stood to the side with a ledger on his lap, measuring names against knots. Scribe Lai had written the edict 2 days earlier and handed it sealed to Envoy Zhao. That sequence of acts, ink, seal, delivery, was the chain that made bodies public property. The narrator noted each movement. He wrote down the governor's mark and the districts named by ink strokes, and he felt a professional certainty rather than pity. The central problem was visible from the raised platform. Punishment had been recoded as administration. Magistrate Wen had accepted quotas. The court had decided obedience through spectacle. The narrator recorded the decision as procedure. He turned the page and waited while the executioner checked the bamboo splints. An onlooker shouted a name. A woman thrust forward and clawed the peasant's arm. "Anne," she cried. The peasant did not answer. A strap pinned his shoulders. The Executioner Wu, ran a rough thumb along the rope and barked, "Tie tighter." His voice left no room for negotiation. The crowd stilled and the bamboo frame creaked as soldiers set the angle. The first scene established the law's face. The bamboo splints were nailed as if assembling a crate. Guards lifted a wooden wedge and pushed it between limb and splint until a joint gave a soft, sickening pop. A spectator said, "They do it slowly so the others learn." The magistrate did not look up. He was cataloguing who watched. Scribe Lee walked to the edge of the platform, ledger underarm, and read the article of the edict aloud so the record would exist in 2 forms. Paper and Witness, Article 7. Corporal enforcement by bamboo splint is authorized in cases of sedition and tax arrears, he intoned. Envoy Zhao stood behind him with an expression that tightened his jaw. By order of the governor, Zhao added. The narrator circled a margin and underlined the clause. The act turned a bloody scene into enforceable policy. The crowd's mood shifted from curiosity to unease in 5 heartbeats. A man near the magistrate elbowed his neighbor and whispered that the lists had names taken from a rival clan. A whispered suspicion moved to the rim of the circle. The narrator wrote the whisper down with a precise timestamp. He recorded not emotion but the chain. Rumor, accusation, the magistrate's tablet. Peasant Han, wrist still raised and raw, was dragged from a dark cell and forced to stand before the magistrate's table. He pressed one palm to the scar on his forearm and spat blood into the dirt. Officer Liu, a junior official, held the sealed list and declared, "You identify them or we return you to the platform." Han's voice trembled. "They paid to live," he said. "They paid. I could not buy my father's life." His words landed as proof of corruption. Magistrate Wen tapped the lacquered table with a nail. "Names on the list are validated," he said. "You will point and we will proceed." Scribe Lai's pen paused. He had transcribed bribes in previous entries, but never so plainly admitted. Envoy Zhao stepped forward and lowered his voice to the magistrate. "We follow the governor's orders," he said. "This is not for debate." The tone implied both threat and covering logic. The narrator annotated the exchange, marking where law met purchase. The emotion shifted then, from suspicion into rising fear. Scribe Lai's hand trembled once while he sealed the next page. He closed the ink pot with a clack and looked at Envoy Zhao as if measuring a man's courage. Zhao's eyes did not waver. He turned and left a shadowed space between himself and the scribes. Later, in the surgical annex, Surgeon Chen removed a linen cover and exposed a table of instruments. He lined steel scalpels and a set of blunt bifurcators like a craftsman arranging chisels. Executioner Wu demonstrated a bamboo procedure on a jointed cadaver limb, while junior official officer Leo took notes with an exacting hand. "Insert the wedge here, Wu." And he showed where pressure produced the snap that broke cartilage without severing artery. "Allow the bleed. Then press until bone gives." Officer Leo wrote each technical point. How long until a man cannot stand? Wu lifted his head, measured a breath, and answered, hours, for some days. It depends on the joints and the stomach's holds. Surgeon Chen made a small notation about infection and chronic pain outcomes. They discussed duration like mechanics discussing a machine's failure point. The narrator recorded each step without commenting on the men who would feel it. The annex talk confirmed the ritual nature of the violence. It was no impromptu violence. It was a repeatable method. The junior official's notepad would travel back into the administrative archive and into every magistrate's hands where the edict applied. The narrator closed the ledger and crossed a line. Each crossing meant another man elsewhere would be put on the same plank. When Scribe Lai discovered a sealed amendment in the archive that carried the governor's wax, his hands stayed steady only for a moment. He slit the wax and unfolded a single sheet that redirected enforcement to a named rival clan. He read, Appendix B, reassignment of corporal enforcement to households of the Lingchi estate. For a beat, he did not speak. Then he walked the paper toward Envoy Zhou's office and tapped on the lacquered door. Envoy Zhou opened the door himself, and the two men stood with the amendment between them. Who sent this? Scribe Li. Zhou's voice was flat. It bears the governor's mark. That is your answer, Li pushed back. The lists we signed do not name the Lingchi. This changes enforcement. People will die for this signature. Zhou did not argue the fact of death. Politics require clarity. Scribe Li. The governor clarifies. Scribe Li felt a new weight. He had entered the service to make records, not to choose bones. He hesitated, then said, I will not add names without instruction. Zhao's jaw tightened. Then you will record as directed. Your hesitation is noted. A guard stood in the doorway, waiting to enforce compliance if needed. That quiet presence moved the balance. The chapter's cliffhanger arrived when the next scheduled punishment began and a marked noble emerged from the crowd. He wore a blue sash of a family not listed on any public sheet. The noble's arrival forced the magistrate to respond in front of witnesses. He called, Who placed him here? A counselor shouted back. Envoy Zhou moved the name by private seal. Accusation cut the air. Guards pivoted toward the counselor and seized him. The executioner paused, bamboo half raised as loyalty lines in the courtyard made themselves visible. Executioner Wu lowered the splint a fraction and muttered, Orders first. Who gave the order? The magistrate clenched his jaw and said, The lists are validated. Proceed, but his hand trembled when he signed the new stamp. A rapid exchange followed among the officials. Zhou changed names. The counselor spat while soldiers shoved his shoulders. Zhou, did you or did you not? Envoy Zhao's voice carried calm. I acted on the governor's instruction. Magistrate Wen will confirm. Wen will lie for the governor. The counselor said. Wen has always taken the quiet path. The argument spilled into the audience, and the crowd's shouts rose. The narrator watched and wrote the first names of the men dragged into the square. The confrontation shifted public perception in that instant. Where before the crowd accepted punishment as justice, it now opened a question. Who could be targeted for political ends? A merchant near the gate shouted. Today a peasant, tomorrow a trader. A child on a stoop began to cry. The shift moved from private resentment into open accusation. Fear moved into anger in 3 breaths. Soldiers moved to contain the commotion. They dragged the counselor away, bound him, and crowded the accused noble under the platform. The magistrate stamped an emergency order to reassert control and instructed Scribe Lai to record new names to placate both parties. Scribe Lai hesitated, then wrote. He wrote as if each stroke might be a choice between life and death. After the riot's initial sweep, Magistrate Wen retreated to his office and drafted a new memorandum that reinforced the edict and called for immediate compliance. He placed his seal on it and handed it to Officer Liu, who then went to the archive to have copies made. The magistrate's action converted public disorder into administrative procedure. The narrator described the move in his ledger: riot, containment, codification. Peasant Han, taken from the holding cell as part of the day's roster, pressed his fingers to his scar and mouthed a single name. Lingchi. He did not shout. He watched the magistrate sign. Later that night the magistrate would sleep with his hand on the stamp, and the city's supply lists for firewood and rope. Scribe Lai would cross, reference the roster with the Lingchi houses and find matches. Each match meant another man would be chosen. The narrator closed the chapter in the dim study with a single promise entered into the ledger. He wrote that hidden records, payment receipts, and witness statements would be sought. He placed a thin brass lapel pin on top of the page, slid the ledger into a satchel, and locked the study's door. The promise was framed as an administrative task: retrieve, compare, publish. That evening a soldier knocked on the magistrate's door and handed a sealed list. The magistrate opened it with a small, precise movement and found new names stamped in hurried ink. He ran his thumb over the seals and felt the weight of each signature. He rubbed his jaw, and in that small, practical action he made the decision to keep the lists moving forward. The next morning new men would be brought to the plank. Scribe Lai, sitting with his ink-stained fingers, whispered to Officer Liu, "We record what is given, but who will count the men left uncounted?" Officer Liu replied, "We are clerks, we do not account for fate." The reply was not evasive, it was a factual separation of roles. Li nothing more and closed his eyes for a moment. The pause contained a choice: comply and keep a roof above his head, or refuse and be replaced. Survivor witness peasant Han appeared before the magistrate again under guard. He named 2 officials who had taken bribes. He produced a receipt folded in his palm, and a scrap of lacquered wood with a carved motif matching a governor's seal. "This was passed at the market," he said. The man who sold it said he served the envoy. Magistrate Wen's face did not change. He tapped the table. "These are allegations. We will investigate." The line offered procedure as delay. Envoy Zhao moved through the corridors with a set expression and a list in his palm. He met with a faction leader in a private room and said, "I need your support for the next patrol." The faction leader looked up and asked plainly, "You will take the Lingchi houses?" Zhao answered, "We will place enforcement where stability is threatened." The leader nodded and provided men. The transaction exchanged men for authority. A twist appeared in the archive the next day when Scribe Lai compared payment receipts to village rosters and found a mismatch. Several names on the enforcement lists were not present in census ledgers. They had been inserted. He ran his finger down a column and found the ink different on 3 entries. He called Officer Liu over and said, "These are additions." "The handwriting is not the scribe on duty," Liu read and said. "Then who wrote them?" Lai replied, "Someone with access to the sealed amendments." The discovery changed everything. It showed deliberate alteration. The revelation forced a new sequence of reactions. Magistrate Wen summoned Envoy Zhao and the executioner. He placed the altered page on the table and said, "Explain this." Zhao leaned forward and said, "The governor's instructions were updated. I followed the last sealed directive." The magistrate tapped the table and said, "Then summon witnesses to confirm the seal." The narrator documented the demand as an administrative step that could conceal or reveal culpability. At the courtyard's climax, a marked noble, his name shouted by a councillor, stepped up and faced his accusers. The noble's voice did not tremble. "I am Kun of the Lingchi. I have not broken law, and I hold receipts proving trade licenses." The councillor answered, "You were listed by the envoy's sealed amendment." The noble slammed his hand on the magistrate's table and demanded to see the governor's signature in person. The crowd's roar rose again, and the executioner hesitated, bamboo suspended over a new victim. That hesitation became the chapter's peak. An executioner holding a tool above a man not on any public list, while the magistrate and envoy argued in public. Soldiers shifted position and the crowd surged. The narrator wrote each second with precise notation, counting who moved first, who shouted, and who froze. He recorded executioner Wu's slow breath and the magistrate's reluctant stamp. The delay turned the ritual into a public trial of power. After the confrontation, soldiers dragged the councillor and some protesters away. The magistrate stamped an order to silence rumors and ordered Scribe Lai to record all names present at the riot. Scribe Lai added the new names and the note. Claims of altered lists under investigation. The narrator circled that note. He underlined the phrase and added his own marginalia. Seek original amendment seal impressions. The aftermath did not restore innocence. It redistributed danger. Families associated with the Lingchi fled their houses that night with small bundles. A child dropped a bowl. A woman scooped it up and did not complain. The narrator visited a narrow street and recorded the footprints left by hurried carts. He did not linger over the bowl. He wrote the names of those who fled instead. A final administrative act closed the chapter. The magistrate issued a suppression order that rebranded the riot as insurrection. He instructed patrols to detain anyone found speaking of envoy decisions. The order converted spoken accusation into criminal evidence. The narrator logged the order and noted the clause that allowed selective arrests. He slid the ledger into his satchel, stood, and left the study with the sealed amendment tucked inside. The chapter ends on a concrete movement. The narrator lifts the satchel lid, places the amendment inside, snaps the buckle shut, and walks out into the night's courtyard where a single candle guttered on the magistrate's desk. He set the satchel against the desk and left the candle still burning, its light on the exposed wax seal. Emotion root. Betrayal. Emotion shifts. Suspicion to fear. Fear to outrage. Outrage to constrained resolve. These states manifest in the recorded actions. Scribe Lai's hesitation, the crowd's rising cries, the magistrate's stamped orders, and the narrator's decision to retrieve the sealed amendments. Each choice in the chapter follows from that betrayed confidence in law becoming weaponry. The local conflict resolves into temporary containment, but leaves a clear trail of evidence and a plan to follow. The narrator's final act, locking the amendment into his ledger, creates the bridge to the next chapter's investigation. Magistrate's ledger. The magistrate's seal struck lacquer with a dull finality while executioners pressed bamboo splints against a kneeling man's wrists. Suspicion tightened his hands around the ledger as the scribe pushed the stamped decree across the table. He watched the confined peasant breathe through cracked lips and saw the magistrate's thumb hover over the seal before it came down. The crowd at the tribunal's edge held still. A guard barked an order. A bamboo frame scraped in a corner. Within 5 sentences the central conflict stood. The state had turned punishment into scheduled paperwork, and the narrator intended to trace where those schedules led. He had been present the night in the bamboo courtyard, when the executioner tightened the rope until the peasant's fingers whitened against the wood. That event hung in his notes and in the margins of his ledger. He had written the rope detail in blunt lines, then closed the page and followed the stamped lists into the archive. The memory of the peasant's fingers returned now as a measurement, a way to read the distance between a signature and a body's breaking. He favored concrete observation. He counted the number of stamped decrees on the magistrate's desk. He listened to the scribe's ink scratch and to the guard captain's boots against stone. He did not narrate pity, he recorded sequence and motive. Suspicion drove him first. The suspicion that punishments were not random but scheduled tools of control. Scribe, the guard captain, tapping the ledger, whose names run in this column. The scribe did not look up housema, household servants. 3 entries this month, the scribe said House Liu, a debtors list. These are assigned penalties, captain. The guard captain's jaw tightened. He stepped forward and ran gloved fingers along a margin note. Assigned, he said. Assigned by whom? The narrator leaned closer. He had planned to let records speak, but the ledger's marginalia interrupted method. The scribe turned a page and exposed neat characters stamped and overwritten by quick, rough notes. The narrator's eyes traced annotations that linked names to titles. Retainer of Wong, son of prefect, household of minister X. One marginal note read like a shortened motive, remove influence. The narrator felt an emotion shift from suspicion into calculation. He adjusted his posture to steady breathing and marked the line with his brass lapel pin. They moved into the archive alcove with the guard captain and the scribe. The space smelled of lacquer and old ink. Shelves leaned under bound ledgers. The narrator set the worn leather, bound ledger on a low table and unfolded the pages. He read aloud to himself, each line measured Lingchi bamboo fractures. Formalized, his voice lacked show, it carried cataloging force. The guard captain crossed his arms. Who authorized these entries? He demanded. The scribe answered with a name, then adjusted the ledger, as if hiding another name beneath folded paper. The narrator paused and tapped a marginal note. This note ties penalties to households, not crimes, he said. The guard captain's reply arrived in a low, clipped sentence. Order comes from the magistrate and above. We follow the seal. A shift occurred when a survivor arrived at the infirmary corridor. They brought him in half, dragged, shoulders stooped, a ribbed patch over his forearm, where bamboo had cleaved and healed wrong. He held broken bamboo shards in a palm that trembled. His voice came hollow but fast. They took my neighbor for a list I did not sign, the survivor said. They stamped his name because he owed tea tax. They stamped my wife as brother because he spoke in the market. Magistrate Sorder, the guard captain looked to the narrator. This man lies, the captain said, then hesitated as the survivor set the glaze of bone and splinter on the table. The narrator recorded the confrontation. He short questions name. He said, what day? How did they mark you? The survivor answered in clipped lines, Jin. It happened on the night of market bells. They tied him in the courtyard. I heard the magistrate read the list. The survivor's hands cleaved and moved. His breathing shortened. The narrator noted how the survivor's fingers shook when he presented the bamboo shards. This was not editorial sympathy. It was evidence. They moved next to the Imperial surgeon's chamber. The surgeon kept a cracked lacquer box on a low table. He opened it with practiced fingers and arranged bone fragments in a precise line against black fabric. We catalogue the removed pieces, he said. We keep them as proof of process. The narrator did not flinch at the sight. He recorded the surgeon's terms. Ritualized removal, archival proof. The surgeon's voice held technical calm that made the room colder than the stone walls. The surgeon described the ritual in clinical terms. Lingchi is performed in sections. He explained, it begins with formal incisions, then removal timed and recorded. Family present is noted. Witnesses sign the ledger. The narrator's notes added the times and the names present at each removal. The guard captain's posture shifted. He glanced toward a window that blurred dawn. Emotion shifted again in the room. Calculation became a hard, tense fear when the surgeon produced a file of stamped receipts showing signatures from households now listed as reduced in influence. Dialogue tightened. You stored bones. The guard captain, yes. The surgeon answered, we keep them to verify that sentence was carried out. It is proof for the magistrate and for the court records. For whom is proof? The guard captain snapped, for compliance. The surgeon said, for precedent. For order. That night the narrator cross-referenced ledger entries against the surgeon's file. He found overlapping dates and a consistent pattern. Names tied to households, penalties matched to political purges. Each match was a small revelation. He felt a new motion in his chest. The narrator labeled it alarm in shorthand, but acted through a series of measured choices. Note the page, photograph the marginalia, request the magistrate stock it. An external event altered the reading. The magistrate summoned them to the tribunal chamber to witness an indictment read aloud. The narrator followed, ledger under his arm. The executioners arranged the bamboo frame on the elevated platform. The magistrate, a man with a trimmed beard and a ringed hand, read names in clear, rhythmical cadence. For sedition, he read. For corruption. For undermining order, he paused after each name and the executioners made small, precise gestures. The narrator recorded word for word. He marked where the magistrate hesitated and where a family member screamed. He watched an executioner lift a blade and set its edge against flesh. The first incision registered on the crowd as a sound of leather against bone, and then silence. The narrator did not narrate shock. He notated timing and witness responses. He documented that the magistrate stamped the record closed moments after the incision began. A confrontation followed in the infirmary corridor when the survivor accused the guard captain in public. The survivor spat the bamboo shard at the captain's boots. You read their names and pick who falls. Jin. You use debt lists and household grudges to take those who stand in the way. You sign. The guard captain's face tightened. Jin, the captain said, you will calm yourself or be taken for further questioning. You signed those papers. Jin answered. Don't look at me like I am mad. The ledger is here. The magistrate signed. The surgeon keeps the bones. A rapid exchange followed. Captain, what do you say? The narrator asked. The guard captain snapped back in 3 short lines. I enforce the law. I do not write it. Then who writes it? The survivor demanded. Who marks my neighbor to die? The captain looked to the magistrate behind horned pillars, who kept silence until a scribe leaned in and whispered. The narration shows an emotion shift. Public accusation turned to defensive deflection by authority, then to a small, brittle clarity as a scribal whisper exposed a marginal hand. The narrator asked the scribe to unroll a lacquered ledger. The scribe did so, fingers stained with ink, voice dry. These entries are ordered and scheduled. The scribe said, they are signed according to docket. The magistrate stamps, the surgeon records, the guard executes. The ledger keeps the sequence. The narrator read marginal notes aloud. Reduce house ma, neutralize Wong's retainers, public example. He made precise notations. Marginalia linked to political households, not crimes alone. This was the twist, punishment as political tool. An unexpected reveal came when the scribe stilled and placed a folded page before the narrator. The folded page contained a second column in a different hand, more hurried and with a different ink tone. The scribe said, this is appended after the magistrate's docket. It carries names requested by the prefect. We were instructed to add them quietly. The narrator felt a shift from alarm to grim comprehension. He looked at the guard captain. The captain's shoulders tightened. He tried to step away. Orders from above. The captain muttered, orders from above. The narrator repeated into his notes. They moved to a small, overheated room where the magistrate kept a private docket. The narrator demanded access and was allowed to read under supervision. He found a list that named not crimes but influence. For removal of a household's patronage, one entry read in plain characters. He compared that to the public dockets. The match was exact. The narrator recorded the chain. Private request, magistrate docket, surgeon's recording, ledger closure. The survivor Jin forced the issue in the tribunal again. Magistrate, you read names and seal them. You close families. I have my neighbor's tea kettle at home and his ledger paid. He did not owe. Your stamp sent him. The magistrate's reply came in a few crisp lines. Order must be enforced. He said, the state cannot tolerate rumor and debt that spoil stability. I act for order. The survivor hurled a bamboo shard onto the magistrate's desk. It landed with a dry crack. The courtroom inhaled and the guard captain moved to intercept. Amid chapter mini, cliffhanger arrived when the narrator discovered a marginal link to a powerful minister's household. The notation read suggest removal by prefect to weaken minister. The narrator felt that twist translate into immediate danger. These punishments were not only cruelty but instruments of political dismantling. He wrote the name, folded the page into his coat, and left the archive with a step measured for silence. Outside the tribunal, the crowd shifted. Someone recognized the minister's name, low voices rose, and then a patrol ordered them back. The narrator kept walking. He was aware that the ledger in his pocket now carried not only bone evidence and marginalia, but also a motive that connected the magistrate to higher authority. He felt action rise in him. He would trace signatures, follow the fold of paper to its origin, and publish the sequence into the ledger he kept. Back in the surgeon's chamber, the surgeon removed another fragment from the lacquer box and set it under candlelight. Records protect procedure and authority. We have no choice. The narrator watched as the surgeon's fingers trembled slightly when he handled a small collar bone. This small physical cue revealed fear in a man who spoke otherwise in sterile terms. The narrator noted the tremor as evidence. Even those who framed the procedure felt its moral cost. Confrontation circled again when the guard captain argued with the magistrate in private. The narrator had not been allowed into the private room, but he overheard through the skirting of a door. The magistrate's voice was flat. "You enforce." "I decide," the guard captain replied. "We will not be the blunt instrument for personal vendettas." The magistrate's next line came low and cold. "Then you will choose which side of the ledger you are on." These 3 lines of exchange sharpened the stakes. Enforcement versus choice. They returned to the archive at dawn. The narrator checked the surgeon's ledger with the magistrate's docket and found an entry that changed interpretation. A set of marginal notes linked convicted names to newly formed tax regulations that had been forced through by a minister last month. The narrator realized in a precise, physical way. Policies and punishments were synchronized. He recorded the times the decrees were signed and the times the executions occurred. He made a small list and underlined names that repeated. A new twist followed when a scribe admitted under pressure that some entries had been backdated to avoid public scrutiny. The scribe said, "We were told to adjust dates when necessary." "It keeps the order tidy," the guard captain snapped. "Adjusting dates changes the appearance of motive. We were ordered," the scribe repeated. The narrator watched the captain's face harden. The captain touched his sword and stepped away. This scene presented multiple named secondary players whose choices redirected the narrator's inquiry. In the execution platform, the Lingchi ceremony began as scheduled. The magistrate read the indictment, executioners assembled, and the crowd watched in a precise hush. The first incision was carried out, and the surgeon checked a cloth token and logged the time. The narrator recorded each motion and each witness signature. He watched family members press hands to their mouths and the guard captain's stamp the record closed. The public ritual completed a bureaucratic loop from private request to public annihilation. After the ceremony, a survivor collapsed at the courtyard periphery. The magistrate stamped his docket, and the guard captain enforced a silence by pushing witnesses back with the butt of his halberd. The narrator followed the stamping as if tracing an invisible needle through paper into flesh. He closed his ledger, wrote a single marginal note, "Chain of command confirmed," and sealed the page with a small brass clip taken from his pocket watch chain. The clip was an act, not an appeal. The final pages of the chapter show the narrator cataloging marginalia and closing the file. He cross-referenced the supplementary column with the magistrate's private docket and found the prefect's hand in multiple entries. He noted precise dates, signed names, and the small, hurried inking that indicated post-facto additions. He wrote the sentence he would carry forward. The ledger was not a neutral record. It was an instrument deliberately used to reorder power. He ended this account with a concrete action rather than a reflection. He rose from the archive, placed the folded page with the prefectus notation into a sealed envelope, and handed it to the scribe with instructions to copy and forward only if necessary. He spoke in 3 short sentences: "Make 2 copies, send 1 north. Keep 1 here. Do not let the guard captain see the duplicates." The scribe's fingers went still. "Yes, sir," the scribe said. The guard captain looked up from the doorway and the magistrate's eyes slid toward the ledger. The chapter closes on that exchange, a decision made, a document moved, and a quiet step toward the next inquiry. He left the archive with the ledger under his arm. The name of the minister's household burned into his notes. and the memory of the peasant in the bamboo courtyard. White fingers against wood, etched as measurement. The final beat was not a grand vow but a situational shift. The narrator placed the sealed envelope in his coat and walked toward the stair that led out of the court, knowing he would follow the chain of signatures that had converted law into targeted erasure. Emotion roots guided every choice in this chapter. Suspicion led him into the records. Calculation forced him to cross-reference. Alarm pushed him to fold pages and make copies. Each emotion shift appeared through concrete actions. A brass clip, a folded page, a copied docket, a hand touching a halberd. The ledger closed, but the chain of command remained open for further tracing. Edicts and flesh. A guard shoved the bound prisoner down the torchlit corridor and pushed the ledger across the magistrate's desk as if closing a business deal. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw. He watched the ledger's lacquer catch flame from the torchlight and counted the stamped seals by touch. The problem stood concrete in the first minutes. Paperwork had become an instrument of flesh. He moved from corridor to chamber to courtyard in the span of a single night, following the stamped mandates that bore the state's intent. He was described in records as precise and unemotional. He kept his coat buttoned to the throat, the worn leather, bound ledger at his elbow, and a brass lapel pin that had long lost any shine. In person, his pauses lengthened into tools. A measured breath, a tilt of the head, a slow reach to open a folded ordnance. That restraint was not indifference. It was method. Suspicion guided him to treat each signature, each seal impression, as evidence rather than rumor. The transfer had started 3 doors back. A guard named Zhao shoved the prisoner, hands tied, knees scraped, toward the yard. Move him, Zhao, the magistrate signed. The prisoner made a small sound and zen. The executioner's apprentice wiped bamboo dust from his palms and watched. The narrator followed without a word. He kept his distance and noted the chain of motion. Guard moves prisoner, scribe slides ledger, magistrate weighs a stamp, executioner prepares wood. At the magistrate's desk, the scribe, Lin, placed a fresh seal beside a pile of stamped decrees. The narrator crouched to inspect the edge of the ledger. He found an extra fold tucked between pages, a mandate bearing another seal and a name he did not expect. He read the name aloud without lifting his eyes. Inspector Yao. Lin looked up. Inspector Yao. Lin, yes, the narrator replied. This authorizes enhanced measures. He let the phrase land like a stone. The magistrate, who had been folding his sleeve, did not move his hand back from the seal. The narrator's suspicion shifted into a tentative dread when Lin handed him the folded paper. He felt a tightening across his ribs that he did not name aloud. Instead, he shifted his stance and set the ledger between them on the table. He touched the lacquered cover and counted the impressions again. Each impression matched an executioner as name the magistrate used without hesitation. They moved to the courtyard because the magistrate signaled the order to proceed. The courtyard smelled of damp straw and old sap from bamboo. The executioner, Kao, and his apprentice, Zhen, bent to assemble splints and leather straps on a low trestle. The prisoner was brought forward, forced to kneel on cold stones. A group of men clustered along the yard's edge, their sandals scraping, their voices low. The narrator kept his distance at the scribal anticambus threshold and recorded names in a ledger. Prisoner Chen, Magistrate Wu, Scribe Lin, Executioner Kao. The narrator spoke rarely, but when he did he used short, measured lines. Lin, he said, where did the mandate come from? Lin answered, it was folded inside the inspector's folder. The rider left it this morning. Magistrate Wu did not open it in front of me. He bit the inside of his cheek. He me to seal it straight away. Magistrate Wu, the narrator said, looking toward the inner chamber, did you authorize the inspector's measures? The magistrate's hand stayed flat on the table. The inspector's word is final when appointed, he said. He spoke like a man reading an official line from memory. Orders arrive. Orders are carried out. That exchange became the chapter's first escalation. The narrator's suspicion slipped into a second emotional shift, from doubt to urgent concern. He stepped toward the magistrate's desk and found a folded clause with a different ink. The clause named offenses that required exemplary correction and permitted unusual methods. The words were precise and cold. A man with a scarred chest and a limp, identified to the narrator by Lin as the survivor, informant Han, slipped into the scribal antechamber and bent over the ledger. His right forearm bore parallel raised lines where bamboo had once been used. His fingers were spindled with colluses and old burns. He did not offer a plea. He placed his palm on the ledger and drew breath. Han, the narrator said, "Show what you can." Han unbuttoned his sleeve. The courtyard light sliced across the white ridges of healed skin. They pick the bones that will frighten a village. They leave the hand that writes. They brand what remains. The magistrate writes it down and the inspector signs. "That is enough. Who signed this?" The narrator asked. Magistrate Wu may stamp. But the order comes from higher, Inspector Yao. He gives the clause. Han's voice was flat. He did not plead for mercy. His body told the story. A thumb with an old fracture, a wrist crooked where bamboo had been tied and forced. Dialogue in the antechamber multiplied the sense of conspiracy into the room's air. The narrator watched Lin's fingers tremble as he turned the folded page. He watched the magistrate's jaw move once like an oil hinge. The narrator registered every motion as argument, ink, seal, the movement of a hand away from a stamped decree. 3 paragraphs later, an event displaced their argument. A guard returned from the corridor, breathless. The rider left more orders. Xiao. He carried a sealed note from the inspector. He the magistrate to sign publicly. The narrator folded his hands on the ledger. He forced his face to stay empty. The shift from concern to something harder, controlled outrage, unfolded as a restraint in his voice. Lin, copy that clause into the record. Right the time the rider appeared. Note the seal impressions. He spoke like a man composing evidence. His cadence shortened, each phrase a tool for the record. The executioner prepared bamboo splints while Zhen checked the straps. They spoke in practical lines about grain and measurement and how many splints fit into a palm. This method convinces the crowd. They see a fracture. They obey a month, Zhen added. We must be precise, Cao. The magistrate demands ritual. We do not overstep, Ko replied. You learn to split without tearing skin too deep. You learn where to break so the body holds longer. Those sentences were technical and concrete. The narrator recorded them into the ledger as speech and context. He did not amplify horror with adjectives. He noted measurements. Splints 3.5 inches in length, straps of boiled leather, a 2-man hold to pin a wrist. At midday the narrator and Lin returned to the magistrate's inner chamber with the folded mandate in hand. They laid it on the table between the magistrate and the scribe. Lin's hand hovered. Magistrate Wu, the narrator said, this mandate names Inspector Yao and authorizes extreme measures. You signed without reading it aloud. Why? Magistrate Wu's reply was a single flat sentence. Politics requires expedience. The inspector's seal preserves my office. I did what I must. A confrontation followed. The narrator did not raise his voice, but his questions multiplied. You signed for the inspector. Did he travel here? Did he instruct these methods in person? He did not come in person. His courier carried the word. It is enough, Lin, the narrator pressed. Where did the courier find you? Lin answered, outside the eastern gate. He handed the seal to me in the doorway and said, do not delay. He looked at the narrator. We were given no time to refuse. That argument produced a rapid exchange. It was short and sharp. You speak of orders. The narrator said, orders require a chain. Where is the inspector's warrant? It is here. Wu, show it, the narrator said. Wu slid a folded page across the table and looked away. The rapid back and forth, 3 to 6 lines of compressed argument, changed how the narrator assessed culpability. It exposed choice. Magistrate Wu had options. Lin had options. The courier had delivered a sealed document, and those who received it could have resisted. Outside, the courtyard filled as the executioner began his ritual. People clustered at the walls to watch the removal of a man's dignity. The narrator stepped into the pale ring of light. He recorded the executioner's procedures as if transcribing a technical manual. Bind wrists with hemp, position splints along the forearm, apply measured strikes with a mallet. Called out the count in a practical voice. He did not shout to rouse the crowd. He spoke to maintain his rhythm. The climactic moment arrived when the executioner performed the mandated first incision of Lingchi. The courtyard fell to a hush of breath and shoe scrape. The narrator wrote the cut as clinical notation, a vertical slice through cloth and flesh at the ordered point, measured by chaos angle and the apprentice's steadying hand. The prisoner made a sound, not an appeal, but a bare-bone cry of air that leaked from a throat pressed between rope. That sound changed the narrator's restraint into urgent action. He moved forward and said, "Stop," it without flourish. Two guards looked at him. "Stop the procedure," he ordered. "This mandate must be verified." Magistrate Wu's face remained smooth. He raised his hand just enough to indicate continuation. "Proceed," he said. "The order stands." Then Han, the survivor informant, stepped between the executioner and the prisoner and shouted one sentence. "You are killing them to keep people quiet." His palm hit the back of the executioner's forearm. Ko pushed Han away. Zen struck Han across the shoulder with a strap. The courtyard broke into movement. The narrator's voice cut through the noise. "Lin, note time. Zhao, hold positions." He issued commands like a man securing evidence under contest. A new reveal altered the case. In the scuffle, Lin's sleeve caught on a pressed corner of the ledger, and a page slipped free to the ground. The narrator stooped and picked it up. The page bore a notation in a different hand. A phrase that specified targets not by crime but by political affiliation. It named a faction head among the villagers, and a list of attempted reprimands that looked less like justice and more like purge. The narrator's suspicion hardened into clarity. He felt a tactical calm replace the earlier dread. "This is not deterrence. This is selection," he added. "Record this page under Inspector Yao. Copy the handwriting, Lin." He did not shout. He dictated like a man writing a deposit to the state of record. The narrator demanded a decision from Magistrate Wu. "Will you halt further procedures until an inspector's representative confirms this in person?" he asked. Wu's reply was a thin smile. "The rider is gone." Orders were sealed. The people demand example. The law permits immediate action. That refusal became a pivot. The narrator had a ledger. He had witnessed the courier. He had heard Scar's and Zhen's description of procedure. He had also seen the magistrate SEs in signing. He had to choose a next move that would preserve evidence and disturb a machine of violence. He ordered Lin to copy the ledger in full and asked Zhao to fetch a clerk who could secure the court's outer gate. He assigned Han to catalogue survivors who could testify of previous bamboo punishments. Outside, Cao resumed his work after forcing Han back. The executioner hammered a splint with a precise rhythm. The narrator recorded the rhythm's counts and the number of strikes delivered. He dictated the details into the ledger by making short, crisp notes aloud. 3 strikes left forearm, 2 straps repositioned. No physician present. Each notation tightened the legal net. Within the next hours, a messenger from the provincial watch arrived with a second rider's report. Inspector Yao would be present in 3 days to review records. That arrival created a mid-chapter cliffhanger. The narrator closed the ledger, slid the folded mandate into its slot, and watched Magistrate Wu make a small, almost invisible sign to the executioner. The sign confirmed that suspension now was improbable. The narrator's voice, calm, merciless, registered the fact and nothing more. He did not let his own hands betray him. He kept them folded. He catalogued names and times, instructed Lin to copy the courier's handwriting, assigned Zhao to record every arrival at the eastern gate, and sent Han with a list of survivors to gather testimony. He arranged for the ledger to be sealed in 2 separate places, one for the court and one he would take to a neutral clerk. He did not promise safety. He arranged record keeping. The final cadence of the day narrowed to a small concrete action. The narrator turned the page, wrote the time of the first cut, and sealed the folded mandate back into the ledger with his thumb over the lacquer. He spoke a single instruction to Lin and to Zio and to Han. Preserve what you can. Note the rider's time. Bring witness names before dusk. He left the magistrate's chamber with the ledger under his arm and a list of names in his memory. The magistrate returned to his seat with the same calm face he had shown at the start. The narrator walked out and into the corridor where the rider had been seen, and a new footstep sounded behind him, another messenger arriving with news for the inspector. He moved toward that sound without haste. He had suspicion at the start of the chapter. It had shifted into dread, and then into focused clarity. He had forced choices. Order the copies, gather witnesses, catalogue the executioner's technique. The chapter closed not on a moral summation, but on an act that would force the next event. He sealed the ledger and stepped into the corridor, where someone knocked twice on the magistrate's inner door. The knock was precise. It demanded attention. The narrator paused, his hand on the ledger's spine, and the door opened a fraction when Magistrate Wu answered. The narrator looked at the ledger and then at the magistrate, who made no attempt to hide his composure. The outside rider's footsteps thudded toward the gate. The chapter ended with that single exchange of knocks, a concrete beat that tied the day's documentation to an approaching inspector's visit, and the ledger's contents now bound to a question of authority and exposure. Statutes of flesh. A lacquered seal thudded onto the board as executioners strapped a shackled man to the carved Lingchi platform. Suspicion tightened his jaw. The narrator watched the seal, the way the lacquer pooled at the edge, and the magistrate's thumb pressed until the red softened. He moved closer to record the number on the margin, eyes fixed on the inked characters. The immediate problem was concrete. The new amendment on the board authorized ritualized mutilation as policy and listed quotas tied to tax revenues. That list turned punishment into bookkeeping and men into columns. He had spent his life cataloging decrees, but this morning the work felt like counting bodies. The narrator set down his ledger, ran a finger over the gilt edge, and felt the grain of the lacquer. He had read the magistrate's lists before. He had watched a scribe slide a stamped decree over a table in the archive 2 weeks prior and seen the crowd in the courtyard thin. Now the seal on the platform announced expansion. He did not speak. He recorded numbers. His hands told more than his voice. They trembled when he copied the quota figures. Scribe, the magistrate ordered, read the amendment aloud. The voice was calm, measured. The scribe folded the paper and cleared his throat. 100 names every quarter. The scribe read, except exempts as stamped. The narrator's suspicion shifted toward a concrete dread. He stepped back and watched the executioners set the first bamboo splints against the man's wrists. The man on the platform opened his mouth and could not form a proper breath. The chief executioner worked with a practiced rhythm, his hands like levers. Apprentice Lying stood near the wall, palms against his thighs, face pale beneath the candle glow. The narrator's name did not appear in the amendment, but the ledger had room for notes. He understood the mechanism. Quotas could be redirected, names could be stamped under new categories, an economy of removal linked to revenue and order. He closed the ledger slightly and let the edge rest against his palm. His chest tightened in a way he refused to name aloud. The scribe's voice continued, political purge, category C, local officials and tax defaulters prioritized. Experimental cases, 3 per magistrate. The narrator wrote the phrase exactly. He copied the characters, then hesitated and wrote them again in the margin. Hesitation became a small resistance. He rubbed the ink with his thumb until it blurred. A former convict had come to him once, a month earlier, and showed him a torn strip of cloth, and a bone fragment. The narrator remembered the smell of copper on the cloth, the way the convict angled the fragment in the lamplight, so the narrator could see the knife marks along its edge. The convict had said, "They test first on those no one counts." The narrator had catalogued that admission as a note. He had not expected a stamped, public amendment to formalize the tests. He moved to the archive alcove once the magistrate left the platform. He kept his voice low and his breathing even. He needed to verify the stamped page that authorized quotas. In the alcove, the scribe laid out the amendment on lacquered wood and lit a small candle to read the finer seals. The narrator slid a finger over the wet wax impression and counted the ridges beneath his nail. "This will be copied into the ledger at once," the scribe said. "It must be recorded to the margins." He did not look at the narrator when he spoke. He worked with pages the way others handled tools. The narrator watched him mark the numeral that tied the purge quotas to tax shortfalls. "Magistrate," the narrator said, "quiet and direct, these numbers. Who decided the categories?" He put the question into the room as a factual inquiry, not a moral pronouncement. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. The magistrate decided. He replied, "Order is expensive. Order requires calculation. The state must account for threats and their cost." That reply shifted the narrator's suspicion into a new motion. He felt a rising anger that he kept folded into precision. He snapped his ledger closed with a soft click and walked to the shelving where past decrees were kept. He needed cross-references, a proof of authorization. He catalogued, compared seals, and wrote marginal notes in tight, regular script. In the executioner's antechamber later that night, the chief executioner demonstrated bamboo, splitting on a stack of inert splints. He wedged a thick stock into a vise and struck. The bamboo split cleanly, fibers peeling like thin paper. "Watch the grain," he said to apprentice Liang. "Find the weakest point. Break it where the bone will follow." He tapped the splinter against the bench and held the piece up. Apprentice Liang's fingers recoiled. "Is it always like this?" Liang, his voice had the tremor of a man new to a task that leaves marks. The chief executioner shrugged. "It is a tool. We learn the tool." His voice had the same plainness as the magistrate's. He never admitted hesitation. He kept rhythm in his hands. The narrator stood at the doorway, ledger tucked under his arm. He recorded the demonstration with a shorthand. A list of techniques, a note on angle and applied weight. He one question aloud, "Have you performed it on a live subject?" The chief executioner did not meet his eyes. "On political orders, yes. On experimental subjects, only as needed." He touched the back of his neck, a small, practical gesture. The narrator took that sentence into his ledger and circled it. At night, a former convict arrived by the hidden corridor, moving like someone who still read the room for danger. He kept to the shadows and slowed his breathing when guards passed. The narrator met him at the lacquered chest. The convict produced a torn strip of rough cloth and a bone shard, both smelling faintly of candle smoke and iron. "They called it discipline," the convict said. "They called it precise. They called me an example." "Show me the cloth," the narrator said. He did not ask for more explanation. He wanted facts. The convict unwrapped the cloth, exposing a small length of skin, stained fabric, and the bone fragment embedded with splinter marks. The narrator pressed a gloved finger to the fragment and felt the serrations. "When did they test this?" The narrator asked. 2 months after the new magistrate's list. The convict replied. "They took 3 men that night. They would grade them and decide." He swallowed and looked away. The narrator wrote the date in the margin, then underlined the magistrate's seal in his notes. He felt a shift. Suspicion became urgency. He had proof a test had occurred, but it was still a fragment saved by chance. He needed names. At dawn, back in the cataloging room, the narrator opened the ledger and found a stamped page listing officials to be processed. The scribe watched him as he turned pages. "Those names are sealed for processing," the scribe said. "The magistrate wants speed." The quotas must be met. The narrator read a name and recognized the handwriting of a local tax clerk he had once crossed paths with in the market. He traced the ink with an index finger and felt bile rise in his throat. The ledger linked quotas to revenue streams. A tax shortfall now justified removal. The narrator folded the corner of the page to mark the name and slipped his finger beneath the fold to measure the wetness of the ink. He felt a new shift in emotion. The measured recording turned to revulsion. He refused sentimental language. He had a body reaction, his jaw clenched, his palms dampened, his breathing shortened. He set the ledger down and closed his eyes for a single counted breath. Then he opened the ledger again and continued to copy the stamped entries. An execution that had been publicized as spectacle became a private trap. The platform had been set for witnesses, but guards redirected viewers and kept the magistrate close to the ledger table. The narrator moved to document the event and was halted by a guard who checked his ledger and ordered him to stand aside. When he attempted to reach the platform, the magistrate pointed toward a name. "Stand there." The magistrate said, "Record what you see. You will sign when it is done." His authority translated the room into compliance. The narrator stepped to the corridor and watched the chief executioner work methodically on the prisoner named in the ledger. The cords creaked. The bamboo touched skin. The prisoner gasped and then made no sound the way a broken bell makes no ringing. The narrator held his pen without writing for a long beat, then forced his hand to move. A guard leaned close and hissed, "Do not look at the face when it is finished." It is easier for the crowd. The guard's instruction was pragmatic, not cruel in its tone. Cruelty came in the detail. The narrator obeyed the instruction outwardly, but remembered the convict's torn cloth and the bone fragment in his pocket. He had hidden them there when the attendant passed. A sudden commotion rose near the magistrate's table. A scribe spilled ink when his sleeve caught the candle. The scribe cursed and bared his teeth in a flash of human panic. The magistrate slammed a hand on the ledger to stop the spill, and a seal slid off the page and clattered to the floor. For a second, the room leaned toward chaos. That noise became a pivot. A single inattentive attendant bent to pick up the seal and left his pocket open. The narrator's fingers moved. He pocketed the lacquered bone shard and the magistrate's dropped seal. He slid them into the ledger jacket with the same deliberation he used when copying names. The motion was small and precise. It was a theft practiced by a man who knew the weight of a page. He did not dramatize the act. He catalogued it in his mind as evidence. At once a guard noticed the missing seal, who moved. The guard demanded. He stepped toward the narrator's alcove with the blunt force of someone executing an order. The narrator folded his hands and let the ledger rest on the table. "I was recording the names," he said. "I did not touch the seal." He answered in even tones to buy time. The guard motioned for the magistrate. The magistrate's face had a hard vertical line between his brows. He approached, glanced at the closed ledger, and then at the narrator. "Do you have anything to add?" The narrator lifted his chin. His voice remained measured. "Only the record, magistrate. I record what is given me to record," he said plainly. Saying it bound him to a roll and to the ledger he sought to protect. The guard searched the area and found nothing. The scribe situated the candle and the room steadied. The narrator felt a collapse of immediacy. The public spectacle had returned to its ritual cadence. The prison attendants wheeled away the remains and the magistrate sealed the ledger anew. After the crowd dispersed, the narrator retreated to the quiet cataloguing alcove. He opened the ledger jacket and removed the lacquered seal and the bone shard. The seal still smelled faintly of wax and burnt oil. The bone shard bore striations that matched the bamboo splinters he had seen split earlier. He set them on the desk and wrote a single line. Experimental usage confirmed. Names attached. Quotas linked to revenue. The line was factual, without editorial flourish. Apprentice Lying found him there. Lying's hands trembled more now than in the antechamber. His sleeves were smudged with ash. You saw it. Lying, you watched the platform. His words were short. He did not name the thing he was feeling. I saw the name stamped and the quota written. The narrator replied, "You performed a practice earlier." He kept his sentences precise to maintain clarity. Lying's voice broke into a staccato of confession. I practiced on wood. I practiced on a pig bone once. I did not know it would go this far. He stopped and placed a hand over his mouth. What did the chief say? The narrator asked. Lying swallowed. It was necessary. The magistrate's order allowed it. The tool must be mastered. Lying set his palms flat on the ledger as if to steady himself. The narrator watched his fingers. They argued in a tight exchange about responsibility. Lying's lines came quick. Chief me to watch the grain. Lying, did you see them do it on a man? Not at the demonstration, but you were there that night. Yes, the back and forth lasted several breaths and revealed facts, not judgments. It moved the story forward. A twist arrived suddenly. The scribe returned and produced a folded note from the magistrate. He read it aloud to the two of them. Processing allocations are to be redirected to District 3. The magistrate demands the purge begin tonight. The narrator looked up and met Lying's pupils, which had gone hard. That single instruction changed the calendar. What had been a bureaucratic expansion was now a targeted operation. The narrator realized the ledger's names were not neutral lists. They could be redirected to remove particular rivals. He closed the ledger with deliberate calm. Night deepened. The narrator received a visit. The former convict crept back, bringing more facts. He named a guard who had carried a satchel of broken tokens, and a woman who had been taken 2 months earlier and never seen again. The convict said, they took her because her husband owed tax. They stamped her name as an example. The ledger would make the rest pay. He lifted his hands and showed the narrator an old coin with a notch that matched a line in the magistrate's accounts. The narrator recorded the coin number and the guard's name. He prepared a marginal note that tied the guard's satchel to a district allotment and to a tax collector's missing account. Each small fact tightened the web connecting finance, names, and removal. He felt anger sharpen into resolve. He would use the ledger not simply to copy but to expose. Before dawn, the narrator slipped the lacquered seal and bone shard back into the ledger jacket, but left a copy of his marginal note tucked between 2 pages. He wrapped the jacket and replaced it on the shelf where the magistrate expected it. He did not pawn the items immediately. He wanted one more verification. An admission, a direct line from a man who had ordered the tests. In the courtyard the next morning, the magistrate called for a private accounting. He named a list of officials to review. The narrator was present and summoned to confirm the stamped names. He looked at the magistrate and said plainly, "Magistrate, there are witnesses that the new statute has been used experimentally." The magistrate's lips tightened. "Who names the witnesses?" he asked. The narrator laid out the facts. The convict's fragment, the guard's satchel, apprentice Lying's presence during practice. He spoke in short sentences and read the names. The magistrate's expression did not change in a way the narrator could read. He was a man of deliberate circuits. The magistrate produced a small, curt order and stamped it onto a fresh page. "Record what must be recorded," he said. "Let the law move." He did not deny the experiments. He reframed them as legal tests necessary to stabilize order. That move revealed the twist. The experiments were not aberrations. They were deliberate steps to refine methods the state could deploy. The narrator's understanding of prior events shifted. What he had catalogued as isolated cruelty became a program. The chapter closed with a concrete action. The narrator returned to his alcove, opened the ledger, and underlined 3 names slated for processing that week. He slid the lacquered bone shard into the fold beside them and wrote a single directive in the margin. Preserve evidence. Prepare copies for safe custody. He then placed the ledger on the shelf where the magistrate would find it and left the room. Outside the archive, a guard called his name. He pinned the seal to his lapel, not to display it, but to remind himself of the weight he now carried. He folded his coat tighter against the prey, dawn air, and walked away, ledger sealed and plan forming, the facts set to be either saved or silenced by the next recorded hand. The final paragraph is an action rather than reflection. He closed the ledger, stepped into the corridor, and tucked the lacquered seal under his coat as a promise that he would not let the amendment remain only ink on wood. The final mandate. The executioner hammered the first wedge into the carved Lingchi platform while the unemotional narrator wrote the exact time. Suspicion sat in the margin of his ledger. He underlined the magistrate's seal with a steady hand and wrote the seal's impression number. The courtyard smelled of smoke and boiled rice. The rope rubbed the condemned man's wrists, and the narrator counted the knots aloud, as if they were entries. He noted the number and kept writing. He had come to this execution to record business as law. That was his job. He had recorded seals before. He had watched lacquer pool and dry. He had watched hands tremble and shields of sinew break. But tonight his pen hesitated at a small folded slip pushed beneath the warrant. The folded slip was warm. The narrator's suspicion moved from a word on a page to a decision in his fingers. The magistrate rose from his dais and announced the sentence with deliberate words. "By my seal, the sentence stands," the magistrate said. He pressed the lacquer again, and the red softened at the rim. The guard beside him swept the warrant toward the executioner. The unemotional narrator recorded the magistrate's cadence and the seal's impression, then reached for the folded slip with a gloved finger. He opened it in one motion. Inside was a second mark, a counter seal, smeared and abbreviated, and a short notation in a cramped hand. The notation named a tax petition and a purse. The narrator's fingers tightened on the paper. Doubt followed suspicion. He pushed the slip into his ledger between 2 pages and began to copy the notation verbatim. A scribe watched him from the magistrate's side. The scribe's mouth trembled. The magistrate's face did not change. The guard's jaw worked. The unemotional narrator recorded their faces. He put the folded slip under his ledger, where the binding would hide it. He knew how records were buried. "Scribe," the magistrate said, "read the warrant aloud so the crowd hears the law." The scribe swallowed and set his inked brush to paper. By order of the prefecture, the scribe read, "This man is condemned for embezzlement and refusal to pay taxes. Execution by Lingchi as prescribed." His voice scraped, and he looked at the magistrate for instruction after every line. The narrator wrote each clause without comment. A witness in the crowd pushed forward. The witness had a bandage on his shoulder and a shard of bamboo lodged in his palm. He grabbed the magistrate's dais with both hands and said, "Magistrate, this began with a petition and a purse. The petition named your clerk, Deng." He took a portion, then closed the books. The crowd stirred. The guard hissed and yanked the witness back. "Back!" The guard barked, "Back, or you stand with him." The witness maintained his grip. "I saw the petition," he said. "I saw Deng take the red pouch." The magistrate's lips thinned. The unemotional narrator tilted his head and recorded the witness's name and wound. He paused before writing Deng's name to see if the magistrate would correct the claim. Doubt shifted to a sharper edge. The narrator stood and moved closer to the dais to keep his ledger within reach. The lead executioner checked his tools and did not look up. The magistrate's hand hovered over the seal, then pressed it down once more. The crowd murmured. Someone knelt and spat. The unemotional narrator marked the crowd's movement with short sentences. A woman gripping her child, a man turning his face, a boy covering his mouth. The scribe slid the ledger toward the magistrate, and his hand knocked the folded slip further out from under the warrant. The narrator did not reach for it immediately. He watched the magistrate's thumb. The magistrate said, "Secure the papers." "Proceed." The lead executioner cocked his head. The guard stepped forward and seized the witness by the collar. "You lie," the guard hissed. "You would make trouble for the magistrate." The witness spat blood. Deng took the petition, he said. He signed it as settled. He took the coin from the man who complained. The magistrate's jaw moved. He called, "Scribe, mark time. Record the witness as hostile." The scribe's hand shook as he wrote the word hostile. The narrator wrote the word wrong and then scored it out with a thin line. The crowd's sound rose into a rough single note as the executioner set the first iron. The bound prisoner breathed raggedly and moaned. The unemotional narrator felt his pulse in the base of his throat. Fear came then, not for himself, but for the ledger. If the slip disappeared, the notation would vanish. If the magistrate suppressed the counter, the official record would read a different cause. He reached down, palmed the slip beneath his coat, and moved back 2 paces. A guard closed on the scribe. "What have you done with that slip?" The guard demanded. The scribe's shoulders shrugged as if the question hurt. "I kept the order intact," the scribe said. "I delivered what was given." The magistrate snapped. "Read the last clause." The scribe read faster. His voice caught at the counter, "Seal name," and he glanced toward the narrator as if asking permission to slow. The sheriff's boot scraped the flagstones. The unemotional narrator's doubt shifted into calculation. He moved to the executioner's side and asked, "Will you wait 1 moment?" His voice was flat. The executioner looked down. "There is an order," the executioner said. "Orders are orders," the narrator said. "I must note a discrepancy in the payment clause." The executioner hesitated. He waited a single breath and then nodded toward the magistrate. Forced into a public spot, the magistrate's features tightened. "State your discrepancy," he said. "State it now and be brief." The narrator placed the slip on the magistrate's table and tapped it with a finger. "This notation names a separate seal and a petition concerning taxes," the narrator said. "It places the initiative with the clerk named Deng." The magistrate's face flushed with small color. He barked, "That is a scribe's forgery." The guard tensed. The scribe flinched. He protested. "Magistrate, I—" "Quiet," the magistrate said. He lifted his hand toward the guard. "Seize him if he lies." The scribe put his palms up. "I wrote as I was told," he said. The petition came with the mark, "Who signed?" The magistrate demanded. The scribe's eyes slid away. The magistrate's voice reduced to a thin, iron instruction. "Name the signer," the scribe said. "Deng's mark is on the margin," he said in a voice that tried to be small. There was a quick exchange then, a burst of rapid lines that clipped like stone. Deng took the coin. The witness shouted. Deng signed as settled. The guard said, "You accuse my clerk." The magistrate said, "I will not have slander here." The magistrate added, "Magistrate," the narrator said, "your clerk's name appears on the counter. Seal." The magistrate stared at the slip and then at the scribe. "Deng would never," the magistrate began. "Then why does the notation name him?" The executioner asked, "Explain it now," the guard said. The scribe's shoulders folded. He pushed the ink brush into the pot and said, "I was told to press the seals, to smooth the lacquer, to write the clause as given. I did not see the pouch. I wrote names as I was ordered." His voice broke on the last word. "Who ordered you?" the magistrate demanded. The scribe looked at his hands. A courier from the prefecture brought a note. It bore a second mark. "I only copied." The magistrate's jaw tightened. He nothing and tapped the table twice. A new movement in the crowd. A merchant pushed forward and called, "I paid my taxes, magistrate. I paid my coin and they were recorded. Who pocketed them?" The narrator wrote the merchant's protest. He wrote the witness' wound and the scribe's trembling. He wrote the courier's arrival. Each line pulled the magistrate's certainty toward a brittle edge. Fear sharpened into risk. The lead executioner glanced at the magistrate and then at the bound prisoner, whose chest rose with short, quick breaths. The executioner gripped his knife and said, "Do you wish me to halt?" The magistrate's hand hovered over the seal, and he breathed once. The scribe looked toward the magistrate with pleading eyes. The narrator noticed the small scab on the scribe's knuckle, where he had used his thumb to steady the brush. That small human detail made the scribe's confession more true to the narrator than the magistrate's denials. The magistrate's face hardened. He snapped, "Hold the prisoner. Secure the scribe." The guards moved in. The lead executioner stepped off the platform and approached the scribe instead. He did not raise his knife. He took the scribe by the arm and dragged him forward. "Tell me who sent the courier," the executioner said. His voice was low. The scribe said, "I don't know the name." The courier left before dawn. He carried a sealed order from the prefecture. The executioner studied him. A twist broke free then. The courier's seal matched neither the magistrate's nor the clerk Deng's. The narrator lifted the slip and held it to the guttering candle. He read the counter, seal closely, and traced the edges with a fingertip. The counter seal bore a hallmark used by a tax overseer working at the interstate post. That hallmark placed the petition not as a local complaint, but as an external instruction tied to a named overseer who benefited from expedited collections. The crowd changed from noise to a close hush. The witness who had been dragged forward sucked in a breath and said, "It was to fill pockets along the road. They sent a courier to force us to pay twice." The magistrate's mouth opened. He, who would falsify a prefecture mark. The narrator's pen moved across the page and then stopped. He had the pieces. The courier, the counter seal, the scribe's trembling Deng's name on the notation. The pattern suggested not a lone clerk but a network. Anger rose in the guard's chest. He struck the scribe across the side of the head. "Answer!" he said. The scribe crumpled and then forced himself to sit up. They me to copy. They me to press the seal lightly so the red looks rightful. I did what I was paid to do. The magistrate's face flushed with heat. "Name them." The magistrate barked. "Name the overseer," the scribe said. He called himself Commander Zhao. He to move the petition so the county's share could be diverted to the road overseers. He spat the name like a shard. That name unsettled more than the magistrate allowed. Commander Zhao was an outside figure whose jurisdiction overlapped with the prefecture. If Zhao's men pressured local administrators, a local sentence could be enforced for external gain. The narrator wrote Zhao's name in block letters. The doubt that had started as a margin note now became a possible motive for murder to cover corruption. The magistrate's voice dropped. If Zhao pressured us, he did so without my knowledge. I swear on my post I knew nothing. The guard laughed under his breath. "We all swear on our posts," he muttered. The executioner looked at the bound man and then at the magistrate. "Orders come down and men die," he said. "Do you want me to carry this one out?" The magistrate looked at his seal, at the red lacquer cooling on the table. He called, "Proceed. The law stands." His voice tried to recover finality. The unemotional narrator put his hand flat on the slip and folded it into his ledger. He felt the paper's warmth against his palm and then sealed it beneath the ledger stitches. He would not let the paper vanish into a clerk's drawer. He watched the lead executioner raise his knife. Lingchi began with the first incision made deliberately and slowly. The magistrate's order had turned a legal sentence into an act performed under the public eye. The executioner moved with ritualized mechanics, a measured hold, a shallow cut, the prisoner flinching and then moaning. The crowd hissed. The witness started to cry out and was stilled by a guard's elbow. The unemotional narrator recorded the sequence in short, clipped lines. Incision 1, Incision 2, bones exposed, blood beaded and fell into carved channels. At one point the lead executioner halted. He raised the knife and looked at the magistrate's timing. The narrator saw his hesitation and noticed a smear of lacquer on the executioner's thumb, as if he had touched the seal earlier. That small detail added a new suspicion. The executioner might have handled the documents or the seal before the sentence. The narrator recorded a timestamp and moved to slip the ledger under his arm. He had an idea forming. The courier, the counter seal, the executioner's lacquer. Someone had made this sentence look like local law, so the killing could proceed without outside interference. A sudden shove from behind nearly knocked the narrator forward. A man in the crowd lunged and cried, "Stop!" He fell at the executioner's boots, and his hands clawed at the platform. The guard kicked him back. The narrator wrote the man's name, a petty merchant who had earlier argued about tax receipts. The man shouted, "They take our coin in daylight and call it law at dusk." The lead executioner barked, "Remove him!" 2 guards dragged the merchant away. The narrator wrote the scuffle into the ledger as evidence that the crowd would remember motion and resistance. The climax reached a raw edge when the executioner made the cut that severed the prisoner's ability to scream. The crowd's noise snapped to a silence edged by a single high whistle from a woman in the back. The narrator stopped writing for 3 breaths, and then resumed. He had seen executions before. He had not expected to be moved. He felt something like clarity. That his ledger was not neutral paper, but a place where the record could either protect or erase truth. After the final cutting, the executioners stepped back. The magistrate sat down and the guard gathered the scribe's papers. The scribe's face was grey with sweat. The narrator closed his ledger halfway and watched the guard slide the warrant and the slip under a thick leather folder. The guard's fingers were quick. The narrator's suspicion flared into action. He reached and, in a single motion practiced from years of preserving records, palmed the folded slip that he had earlier hidden, and strapped it beneath his ledger, stitching with a tiny waxed thread taken from his own seal. The scribe collapsed onto a bench. The magistrate's composure frayed. A foreign courier's hallmark mattered now. The narrator had the counter, seal, and the courier's notation. He had 2 witnesses, a merchant, and the executioner's thumb with lacquer. He had enough to write a report that would place pressure on the prefecture's overseers. He also had to survive the magistrate's scrutiny. The magistrate glanced at the narrator and said, "You will sign what you recorded. You will confirm that all procedures were followed." His voice was quiet but hard. The narrator looked down at his ledger and then at the folded slip beneath it. He thought of the scribe's hand, of the wound in the witness's shoulder, of the merchant's shout. He nodded once. Alone later, the narrator sat in a makeshift records tent by a guttering candle. He set the ledger on the table, placed the folded slip within its margin, and traced the counter, seal with a thin stylus. He wrote a short, factual note. Courier arrival time, hallmark description, names mentioned, merchant's protest, scribe's confession, executioner's thumb smear, and the magistrate's order. He sealed the ledger with his own wax and impressed his brass lapel pin into the wax as a private mark. He paused and then marked the contradiction he had seen. The magistrate's seal remained authoritative, yet the notation pointed to external coercion and diverted funds. He wrote the word contradiction and then drew a single line through it. He folded the ledger closed. He slid the folded slip into the inner spine where the stitching would preserve it. He breathed once, a single measured exhale, and closed the tent flap. Outside, someone on the magistrate's dais laughed. The unemotional narrator put his ledger under his coat and walked away from the platform with the gait of a man who keeps records rather than revenge. He had turned suspicion into a preserved sequence. He had shifted doubt toward evidence. He had seen fear in others and chosen to act with a slow, exact kind of resolve. That night he sealed his record and left a copy with a trusted merchant who had refused to take part in the chest of diverted coins. He left contact names and a smuggled note for a judge in the prefecture who had once shown independence. He could not unmake the execution, but he could ensure the paper trail survived beyond the magistrate's seal. He walked down a lane that smelled of wet clay and charred bamboo, his coat damp at the hem. He thought of the bound man on the platform and of the merchant who had screamed. He thought of the scribe's hands. He held his ledger close. The final mandamus had been carried out, but the author of the mandamus had left traces. The folded slip would not disappear while his ink remained legible. He paused at a low gate, felt the weight of his ledger under one arm, and then pressed the brass of his lapel pin into the wax on the ledger's edge, a mark that would identify the true record if questions came. He heard a footstep behind him. He turned and saw the merchant from the crowd standing under a dim lamp. "You will send this where?" The merchant asked. "To a judge who reads facts," the narrator said. The merchant nodded and took the ledger with hands that trembled less than they had on the platform. "I will deliver," the merchant said. The narrator let him go. He watched the merchant disappear into alleys and then closed his eyes for a brief, regulated moment. He had done what his role required. He had turned suspicion into an actionable record. He had written the names, the times, the wounds, and the smears. He had placed a counterweight to a magistrate's seal that wanted finality. The ledger would travel farther than any one man. He did not promise justice. He promised only that the paper would survive. He locked his ledger, pressed his brass lapel pin into the wax again as a final seal, and left the tent, candle guttering. The magistrate's seal sat cooling on his desk across the courtyard. The unemotional narrator folded his hands and stepped into the wet night, ledger against his ribs. The sound of distant footsteps and the echo of a guard's boot trailing behind him. He took one last note before he left. The courier's hallmark number, the scribe's confession in his exact words, the executioner's thumb smear, Deng's signed name, and the merchant's vow to deliver. Then he stood and walked away. He had turned a state ritual into a series of written contradictions. He had preserved the proof that the mandate had been manufactured. The record would not stop the wound that had been cut into flesh, but it would make the wound legible. The ledger closed on the final mandate with a waxed seal and a folded slip safe in its spine. Outside the tent the night kept moving. He walked into it with the ledger and a patience that had been trained by years of keeping records. He allowed no flourish of rhetoric, only a single, concrete act. To hide the folded slip where future hands could find it, and to hand the ledger to a man who would carry it to a judge. That was his verdict. The magistrate's seal was present. The truth, he believed, would not stay buried under lacquer. He left the courtyard behind him, and the smell of boiled rice and fresh lacquer faded. He closed the chapter of the evening in his head with a final line in his ledger and a precise index entry. He had been the unemotional narrator and he had acted. His final action was concrete. He sealed his ledger and trusted it to a merchant, and walked into the dark with the knowledge that paper might yet do what the sword had done too quickly.